Coming up on episode 80 of Omnivore, why scaling up is where food innovation meets risk, and how cell-cultured cocoa could reshape supply, sustainability, and flavor. This is Omnivore, from the editors of Food Technology magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by Almond Board of California. Learn more about almonds, the ingredient people trust, at almonds.org/trends.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. There's a stage of product development that's both critical and often unpredictable: scaling up. What works in the lab or pilot environment doesn't always translate cleanly to full-scale commercial production. Ingredients can behave differently at scale, equipment introduces new variables, and even small process changes like mixing rates or hold times can affect product quality in unexpected ways. That makes scale-up one of the most important and challenging points in the innovation process. Success depends not just on formulation, but on cross-functional coordination, early risk assessment, and disciplined approaches to testing and interpretation. Food Technology's Julie Larson-Brisher spoke with Renee Leber, IFT's Manager of Food Science and Technical Services, about how teams can reduce uncertainty and improve the chances of a successful first production run.
Hi, Renee. Thanks for joining us today to talk about one of the most nerve-wracking stages of product development, scale up.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for having me. Yeah, scale up tends to be one of those points of product development that keep product developers up at night.
Yeah. In your article, you emphasize the importance of conducting a cross-functional risk assessment early in the scale-up process. But why is it so important to involve other teams like production, marketing, QA at that stage? And what kinds of risks often surface during those discussions?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So involving cross-functional teams early in the scale-up process is actually pretty critical because each group is going to bring a different viewpoint. They all have their own priorities and they all have their own areas of expertise. And that seems pretty self-explanatory. But an example of this is going to be something like production teams understand what's feasible at the plant. They understand the equipment capabilities, they understand process tolerances, but they're probably not going to be familiar with market analysis. They're probably not going to be as familiar with your consumers, what they're prioritizing. Marketing is the exact opposite. They'll probably be pretty familiar with your consumers, the priorities, but they're not going to understand the plant limitations. And so, for instance, with these two groups, if you have one and not the other, you either might end up with a product where the attributes that consumers are prioritizing most come through, but then the plant can't necessarily meet them in the way that marketing would like, or attributes that are very important to your consumers don't necessarily get the same level of attention that they otherwise would had both parties been in the room. So bringing in the entire cross-functional team allows the knowledge and especially those limitations to be shared and have those challenges documented early. One thing that is very important to understand is sometimes when you solve one challenge, you might be causing another challenge in a separate area. And I know we talked about this a little bit in the article and gave some examples of that, but it's something where a lot of product developers don't necessarily think through when a solution arises to the challenge, where that might cause other implications within the product.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've heard over the years. The biggest complaint out of like food safety or QA sometimes is looking over at the product developers and going, why didn't you ask us?
And in the industry, product development and food safety quality assurance have gotten a lot closer, which has been a great thing. I feel like it's some of the other teams that sometimes get left out of those discussions, like the plant or marketing, and then attempting to bridge any challenges that arise with a group that wasn't present in the meeting after the meeting takes place just makes it 10 times harder.
Right. Well, one of the big decisions that teams face is whether to run that plant trial before production. So what factors do you think that food product developers should consider when deciding, is that plant trial worth the cost and time?
So the biggest thing people see about plant trials is they are expensive. They're expensive in many ways. They're expensive in the ingredients that you need. They're expensive when it comes to the line time. They're expensive when it comes to the lost cost that you might get on, or lost revenue that you might get on other products that would be running on the line. And so oftentimes when groups think of plant trials, the first thing they think of is everything that's going to have to go into that plant trial from a cost perspective. However, product developers need to consider if there's a specific announced date of launch, or if there's a major promotion tied to the product, where if there's a failed first production, there might be a risk of meeting any kind of public-facing announcement, any kind of public-facing launch date, because that's something that's going to be very visible to your consumers. Another factor to consider is whether any product produced during the plant trial could be used or sold during your first production period and your initial launch. That might be very dependent on shelf life and categories. Some categories are going to have a little bit more leniency. Some categories, there's a decent chance that the plant trial is going to be a waste, which is something that companies will consider very heavily. The overall risk profile of the product is also something that needs to be considered. Products with a higher likelihood of failure, or any true new products where there isn't a familiarity with the type of product, might benefit from a plant trial. This will give you some kind of an insight as to what might happen in a first production. But if this is a line extension where you've changed the color, the flavor, something of that nature, you might not need that same plant trial. You might have a pretty good comparison with a product that you're already creating.
Well, and you're part of that is too that, even those little small changes between that development stage and a production, whether that's a plant trial or actual production, we know that can have a major impact on a product, as you've stated. And in the article, you shared an example involving a low sugar ice cream formulation that behaved differently at scale. So what does that example illustrate about the kinds of variables that teams should watch out for?
Yeah, so that example illustrates how even small differences between development, plant trial, first production can significantly impact product at scale. And so sometimes we like to think that if the change will be small, that any changes that we'll make in the product might be small. That may or may not be the case. So it's always important to note that when you start introducing variables, the effect that they can have on the product might be noticeable. And it highlights the importance of accounting for any changes introduced between plant trial, benchtop, and first production. And one thing that I want to point out here is sometimes these changes are obvious, such as if you are going from one facility to another, if you have your plant trial in one facility and then your first production comes out of multiple plants, if you have a set of ingredients for your first production that might not be the same as the set of ingredients you had in your plant trial, or they can be a lot more subtle. And so it's a lot easier to look at the obvious changes and then try and predict how these are going to impact your product. It can be very nuanced to look at the less visible variables. So it's important to note that some changes might be very obvious, and some of them might be a little bit more subtle. So, for example, of an obvious change, an apparent difference might include running plant trials at one facility where first production will occur across multiple facilities, or change in ingredients if you know that you have one set of ingredients for your plant trial, and there might be multiple suppliers, or a slight change of supplier when you go into production. There are also examples of less visible variables that are just as impactful. And these are more nuanced to anticipate and a little bit harder to predict the impacts of. And so an example of a minor process difference would be during a continuous production, if you use your plant trial to fill your line, have your continuous production, you might not see something like a slight change in temperature in some of the equipment and how that's going to impact the product that you're running. And so that might not come right away. That might come over time. And that can be something that's much harder to predict. But it has an impact on the product, and it's just as important. So I always like to say for those, anything that you can compare this to, if you have any similar products or any research on how similar products have performed with other companies in the field.
Wow. Well, as you pointed out, problems do arise during plant trials. So, like these unexpected texture changes to the product or processing issues. So, what's the best way for teams to diagnose the root cause and determine whether adjustments can really be made in real time or not?
Yes. So when problems arise during plant trial, because for most products, it's a when and not an if, it's important to remember that some of these problems are things that you can address and make the corrections during the actual plant trial. So the priority is going to be to understand the underlying causes of whatever the observed issue is. And it's important to recognize that there are going to be times where there might be more than one factor contributing to the effect that's seen. So teams should closely examine the processing and conditions during the run and work to identify all potential causes. If you find a single variable that seems likely, obviously, if it's something that can be addressed, that can be something that will tell you whether or not this totally fixes the problem. But it can be common where a couple different things happen to produce an effect of a product. Another big thing is watching for trend lines throughout the trial is important. This is something that I and many product developers have probably had as an earned experience learning. But basically, you can have a product that is well within your specification, but if you see that the color is beginning to trend out of it during your plant trial, you pull your beginning, middle, and end product and you say, well, all the color perfect over time, it's all in my spec, but every one gets darker as you go down the run. That's something you need to be aware of, and it's something that you need to take into account, because what that could mean is that as the run continues, you might fall out of spec. And so, again, it's a learned experience. I have had plenty of plant trials where the plant trial was all in spec, and then as we got into larger continuous runs, that could lead to some problems. So one other thing is that if a cause is found and identified in a risk trial or a risk assessment ahead of time, or has been seen previously, there might already be recommended adjustment that can be attempted during the run. So I always like to say you don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. If this is something where you've seen a similar effect on a similar product, if there was a measure that was able to alleviate this, that might be a good place to start. Sometimes product developers really like to go blue sky and come up with an answer that is very specific to the product, and sometimes that's the route you need to go, but not always. Sometimes you can take a solution from a different product and apply that. And once you have identified all the causes, teams can determine whether the changes to the process can be made in real time. So again, if there's an ingredient that maybe you need that you don't have at the plant trial, then you possibly have to call the plant trial, fail the plant trial, and go through a post-mortem. But there are going to be times where you can make ingredient changes on the fly. You can make equipment changes on the fly, and you can see whether or not those have the desired effect. And so with that, one of the things that needs to happen is to pull product from the line, from the plant trial, before and after that change. And you're going to want a couple samples over time. And so you want to be able to see that difference. If you have, for instance, a product that is trending out of spec and you make a equipment change, you're going to need a couple different samples to say, okay, we were seeing this trend line, we made this adjustment, and we saw the product come back into the target of the spec. And you're going to need more than 2 samples in order to show that. So it's always important to remember to take those samples, and those are the data points that you're going to be able to use for any adjustments made.
Okay, so you're a product developer preparing for your first full production run. What are the most important lessons you can carry forward from the risk assessment and plant trial stages, to kind of improve your chance for success?
All right, so I'm going to say 2 things, and they're going to sound opposite, but I feel like both are equally important. The first is that every product is unique, every line is unique, every plant is unique, and so you have to really take the time to dig into all 3 of those to try and understand where any variables might be, where any risks might be, and incorporate your cross-functional team to do that. My second piece of advice is to find every product that is similar, that has been run on that line, that can give you any kind of insight, that's been run with a similar ingredient profile that can give you any kind of insight, and understand that while they are not a one-to-one, it can give you insights as to where challenges might arise. You can get some visibility into where you might need to put in a little extra effort into that risk assessment to see if some of these are likely. And if there's anything that you've run before that is a similar product, look into all the places where you had challenges, where you had some failures. If there was anything that needed to be done that was, for instance, let's go back to that equipment adjustment. Why did that happen? And is that something that could happen with this product as well? And so while it's very important to remember that all products are different and you can't take a similar product and say with certainty these are going to have the same impact on the same line, it's also important to note that while it's different, there are learnings that you can pull through into your product that give you a little bit more visibility into what you might be facing.
Oh, wow. That's really great advice, Renee. And thanks again for sharing your insights with our Omnivore listeners today. It's been a real pleasure, as always.
Thank you for having me, Julie.
Renee Leber is Manager of Food Science and Technical Services with the Institute of Food Technologists. You can learn more about successful food product scale-up in her recent article in the March-April issue of Food Technology. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment. But first, this word from our sponsor.
With consumers' growing concern with gut health and clean label, the 2026 Innova Trends show almonds are an ideal ingredient for innovation. Their fiber and bioactives can help support digestive wellness, and their naturalness makes them an ingredient people trust. Not only that, but almonds have taste, texture, and aromatic qualities which create a sensory eating experience. Learn more at almonds.org/trends.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Global demand for chocolate continues to grow, while traditional cocoa production faces increasing pressures from climate variability and disease to supply chain volatility. At the same time, manufacturers are looking for greater consistency in flavor, functionality, and sourcing. One emerging approach to dealing with these challenges is cell-cultured cocoa, produced using plant cell culture rather than conventional agriculture. The technology is designed to address supply constraints while offering more controlled production conditions. In late 2025, Food Technologies' Kelly Hensel spoke with Alan Perlstein, CEO of California Cultured, about how the process works and where it may fit into the future of cocoa production. Since that conversation, the company has reached a key milestone. Its cell-cultured cocoa powder has achieved self-affirmed GRAS status in the United States, an important step toward full commercialization.
So I know California Cultured is doing a very different, approach to cocoa production by growing the cocoa plant cells rather than obviously farming them. What problem, when you first started the company, what problem were you trying to solve, and how does your cell cultured process work on a high level?
Sure. So I've been working in the forefront of food technology for over 20 years, worked originally on one of the first cell-cultured fish technologies way back in 2003, 2004. One of the only ones that were funding that type of research was NASA. And if you talk to any VC at the time, you sort of were laughed out of the room. And I sort of saw a lot of potential for that technology, but it was very, very early on. And I saw that there was many problems in sourcing foods, ingredients, environmental issues were getting worse and worse. During this time, I started the company Oobly in 2014, led that for about 7 years. I saw that the demands of cultivation were getting more and more difficult to maintain and sustain. We were looking also at chocolate at this time to launch some chocolate braising products, and I saw quite a bit of issues at that time in the chocolate industry. There was issues of child slavery, mass deforestation. And putting all these pieces together, we saw that the demands of chocolate were going to outstrip all natural supply. And also the way that cultivation is happening in these countries is relatively destructive. And we saw that all of these biomes where cocoa thrives in is slowly disappearing every single year. So there's a whole world of problems that has never really been addressed in any considerable way. And we saw that there was a lot of potential technology that could fix all of these problems at the same time.
Very, very cool. Um, so is it similar? Is the process similar to, obviously, I think a lot of our listeners may be familiar with cell cultured meat, cell cultured fish. Is the process very similar, or what can you tell us about it?
In a high level, yes. So you are taking cells from the correct organism, whether if people are trying to culture meat, they would take it from a cow or chicken. So we take our cells from a cocoa bean itself, and that's what we start to grow. You have to basically get the cell in a relatively plastic state. So that means it has a lot of potential to turn into different parts of the plant itself. From there, we also have to basically give it a smoothie of nutrients to make it grow. We're basically using different plant extracts from coconuts, from rice, tomatoes. In essence, where we found that these components that we can extract from these different plants, these are phytohormones, or basically they're different natural plant compounds that basically tell the plant organelles. Usually, when they're very small, you grow into a root, or you grow into a leaf, or you grow into bark, depending of what species you have. So we basically developed a way to sort of understand of what different compounds basically tell from the cocoa tree, basically tell the cocoa bean what to grow into, which can eventually grow into its own plant. So our focus is basically figuring out these compounds that basically keep it as a bean perpetually, but also at the same time get it to grow relatively quickly in a liquid bath, if you will.
Interesting. Okay. So that was one of my next questions, was going to be, obviously, you've already talked about some of the problems facing the traditional cocoa industry, being like climate change, disease. I mean, there's just a whole number of them. So does this new process that you guys have developed, that timeline, does that shrink considerably from like a traditional cocoa process? Okay. That's really
Yes. Yeah. Basically, once the whole process is basically scaled up, we basically see a way that chocolate could be produced at tons per hour anywhere in the world. So that is sort of the type of technology that we're developing.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. And do you see it like in the future, a future state? Do you see it being a complete 100% replacement for? Could it scale to that extent, I guess, that it would be a replacement for traditional cocoa totally, or is it a complement to it, or is it more of like a risk management tool? Like, how do you see it fitting into the industry?
Yeah, we see the demands of chocolate are going to significantly outstrip. When we say that, we think like uh, maybe about 9 to 12 times the demand will be compared to just the sheer amount of cocoa and available land which is to grow it. So we just do not think there's anywhere close to the needed supply. And guess what? If you would actually go scale up to that supply, what's going to happen to the forest? What's going to happen to all these climates? They're going to be gone. And this is basically this big problem. The demand is there. It's coming down the line. Just for instance, 70% of the chocolate of the world comes from West Africa. But what's happening to Africa? It is climbing up the economic ladder. There's more and more demand every single year for chocolate domestically. Why ship it, around the world for a fraction of the profit when you could get 5 to 10x selling it domestically? And that's not even the big demand. We have other countries coming up like India and China, which are becoming absolutely ravenous for chocolate, for coffee, for more of the other middle class foods and flavors that are found all over the world. And they're just discovering it. So there's not even a supply chain available to satiate these countries' demands. And so that is sort of our vision. We just see demand outstripping any conceivable way of producing it. And even if there was attempt to, it would just lead to more environmental destruction.
That makes complete sense. So I think my next question goes to more of like this sensory element. So obviously, I for any alternative products, alternative cocoa, alternative proteins, there's going to be that comparison. How does it compare in terms of flavor, aroma, functional properties? So what have you guys learned so far about this alternative cell cultured cocoa? Does it perform the same? How does it different? How does it compare?
Yeah. So it depends primarily on the technology which you're using to develop these cell lines. So if you would use maybe like the standard technology, which is basically callus induction, which is borrowed from the plant industry, you turn it into a callus, you get it aligned to grow in a liquid suspension, and you can grow quite a bit of the compounds. You could grow fats, you could grow more of the complex pyrazines and other flavor-rich compounds. But we found there was a better way. So we've developed a somatic embryogenesis approach, which sort of allows us to fully grow all the flavor compounds at a relatively equivalent pathway. Now we've shown that we could produce basically thousands of the same flavors and aromas that are found in cocoa. The most surprising thing is after we open up our reactor, it's sort of we're hit with an intense cocoa smell, which is the most strange thing because in all sorts of biotech or even plant science, you almost never smell that. It's always fermenty smells or some media smells coming out. And that was sort of one of our first big surprises. And as we were running our GC and other analytical tools, we were very shocked to find all the precursor compounds that basically you could find in a cocoa bean. And sort of our technology is if we're growing the raw cocoa bean, how can you get the chocolate? This basically means it has to get fermented. It has to get roasted and ground in the right way. So we not only had to figure out this upstream way of developing the cells, but then figuring out the right compatriots with different bacteria and yeasts that break down these compounds to the right, rich, dark, chocolatey, vanilla, creamy flavors that we know and love. And that's sort of what we've been developing on. So we've shown that we could actually produce all the flavors. But right now, it's now bringing them up to the levels that basically match everything else or exceed it. And that's sort of what we found. And by turning these knobs and levels, we found that we could actually shape the flavor profile in unique ways that even these large chocolate companies couldn't, because we could sort of fine tune, oh, there are these flavor groups, and we could find the right microbe to unlock them. Whereas inside of cocoa farms, it's usually random, goes from tree to tree, and then even a fermentation is just a complete guessing game, depending on how many hours, what the temperature is, humidity conditions all impact these flavor. And then even downstream, how it gets dried and processed is also a big concern. Most recently, we've seen many chocolate companies had to reject supplies of native cocoa just because the quality was not consistent all over the place. So there are many issues that happen in growing that really negatively impact the flavor and just lead to massive losses. So our technology can make consistent cocoa of a specific flavor profile over and over and at scale, which could actually satisfy some of the SKUs of these big companies. So, like for instance, they could find a cocoa flavor that might be impossible to grow at scale or have consistently, but we've fine-tuned this process enough that it's consistent from batch to batch at any volume we want, basically.
I know that for a lot of food companies, interest in new ingredients depends a lot on regulatory clarity, scalability, like we've already talked about. Where are you guys at now in terms of commercialization and regulatory processes, and what kind of milestones are you hoping to hit in the next few years?
As the FDA is reviewing our GRAS dossier, we're building out our first facility in West Sacramento, where we've been working on a lot of the enabling technology, which has always been a very big question in biomanufactured ingredients. Usually, they require large steel reactors. These have very long timelines to build or commission, and they're also incredibly energy inefficient. They have tons of moving parts, heating jackets, cooling jackets, and require significant amount of energy. So we've been working on the enabling reactor technology. Also, for the last couple of years, we've created a new class of mass producible polymer reactors that could basically grow plant cells economically, scalably, and we've even seen it could outperform steel titers. So we've seen some significant benefits of this type of technology. It's basically a hundredth of the price of traditional systems. So if you want to actually produce products at scale at a competitive price, which I think it's somewhere between $5 to $6 per kilo today, this is the only viable path. It has to be cheap systems, semi-automatable, with lower capex and opex than traditional systems. And this makes this type of technology for the first time actually viable.
Well, you have some very exciting milestones right around the corner for you guys then. Where do you hope to be in 5 years?
Our first product that we're going to be launching in the end of 2026 is going to be something we've been working on for a while. This is a cocoa, which is incredibly high in cocoa flavanols, which are basically the healthiest part of chocolate. Mars, Pfizer, and a couple of different large entities did a very large double-blind clinical study called the Cosmos study on these cocoa flavanols, and they found that it reduces the risk of cardiovascular events like heart attack, stroke, and AFib by over 30%. Other companies like Meiji have seen that cocoa flavanols, for instance, reduce depression and anxiety in some men and women above 50 years old. So it acts sort of as this interesting anti-inflammatory as well in the neuro tissue. So now with all this data behind us, we've actually figured out how to push the cocoa to produce about 20 times the amount of these cocoa flavanols than they would naturally do based upon this technology. So you can actually have a natural cocoa flavanol in a cocoa product that we're aiming to have a lot more affordably produced than what currently exists. So we want to make this basically a part of everyday diets, just as omega-3 has gotten the public's attention for cardiovascular protection, for immunity protection, and we see many similar benefits of these cocoa flavanols as well, especially in a more aging and more demanding world. Where can my food work harder for me? Where can my food provide even more benefits for me? Especially as many food companies are being influenced by the recent trends in GLP-1 based foods. And we think you have to really play in all these fields where you have these significant benefits. And we think consumers really want these better products. And as well, if we can make this cost competitive and affordable, which we think is going to be the holy grail of these technologies.
Well, that's really exciting. And I think, I'm sure I'm one of many people that would say if I can eat chocolate and say it really is helping me and it's healthy, I'd be all over it. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Alan Perlstein is founder and CEO of California Cultured. To learn more about how the food industry is addressing sustainability challenges, from ingredient innovation to more resilient supply chains, visit IFT.org, where we're featuring new content this month on climate impact and the future of food production.
Our thanks to this episode's sponsor, Almond Board of California. Learn more about almonds, the ingredient people trust, at almonds.org/trends.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of IFT.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode.